The Bible says the king's image changed. That is the first clue we're being given. The king's image went from one being seen in a dream to one being worshipped in real life, which would explain why the golden image's dimensions come up short. It was a real structure that the king had built, but that is probably the most amazing anomaly of all. Two things become clear from the idol's dimensions that were given. First, the dimensions of the idol tell us the image wasn't a 3D image at all. It was flat. That would explain why God calls it an image and not an idol. The flat image was a plan, because that's what you do when you write one down. You write it on something that's flat. Secondly, the golden image had very specific dimensions. What's most interesting about that was the dimensions that are specifically mentioned. Note carefully the fact that the image was measured by a factor of 10. If the head of the image measured 1 cubit high, 10 cubits would be 10 heads. That makes a lot of sense spiritually, because the head of gold in Daniel 2 was a prophecy of Israel's covenant with God turned on its head, quite literally. We have to see the irony in this, because it was the king of Babylon, in the context of history, that made 2 universal decrees declaring that Daniel's God was the one and only true and living God. The irony was, the king of Babylon was a more faithful witness for the God of Israel than his own covenant people were. And he was a pagan king. Now, notice also that the king took his understanding of the head of gold and turned that into a real image, because he wanted a kingdom that would last forever. In that sense, then, the image he built was seriously off, because the dimensions we're given don't make any sense at all in the real world. The second anomaly here goes even further. From our study of the tabernacle, we learn that the cubit is God's symbol of his promise to fulfill his covenant. In Deuteronomy 5 and verse 15, God associates the cubit with the fourth commandment, because he says, "Remember how I delivered Israel out of the house of bondage." The mighty hand and the outstretched arm are his 2 instruments of salvation. The cubit and the hand are therefore, in a spiritual sense, the measure of God's deliverance. The hand represents God's deeds or actions, while the cubit represents the measure, or we could say, the parameters of the covenant. Every covenant must be made in terms of at least 3 dimensions. Every covenant involves the who, which are the 2 parties involved, the what, which determines what the terms of the agreement must be, and the when, which involves how long the 2 parties will agree to be bound to the terms of their agreement. Just like an idol made of gold, a covenant must address its 3 most basic dimensions. If the golden image in Daniel 3 was a real idol, that means it should have been measured in 3D. It should have had 3 specific measurements stated in 3 specific dimensions, which would have been its height, its width, and its depth. But as this diagram shows, the image was only measured in 2 of its 3 dimensions, which is what Daniel told the king when he interpreted the vision of the dream in chapter 2. Daniel only mentioned 2 of the 3 dimensions that God had given to Nebuchadnezzar. In both cases, concerning both images, 1 dimension was not mentioned, and that dimension is explained as the one that concerned each one's 3rd dimension of depth, both spiritually and physically. In Genesis 1 and verse 26, the three dominions of this world are said to be the air, the earth, and the sea. In a previous discussion concerning the tabernacle in the wilderness, we learned that the three dominions represent the extent of God's ability to exercise his authority or influence over these three dimensions. They are called dominions because a distance is represented by each one. This is the matter concerning the gift that God gave to Adam in the beginning, precisely because he knew that Adam would forfeit his gift when he would fall prey to Eve's temptation. The issue concerning the three dominions is this: the closer a dominion is to God, who is represented as the light of the sun, the greater will be God's measure of influence over it, which is why the church is said to be in heaven. The church is the dimension that receives the greatest measure of light because it is closest to the sun. The plan at creation was for Adam to be the head of the triangle represented here as its apex, while God would be the monarch that would stand over or above him, being the one that would have the most authority. The dynamic arrow above Adam represents the bond of faith that the kingdom must have with God in order for it to be viable. The kingdom represents the extent of God's influence concerning the light of truth that will shine down upon all those that are under it. Light in the real world has what's called a fall off. Its intensity or influence diminishes as it travels through space. That fall off is shown to be only half as much in earth as it is in heaven. And then there's the third dimension of the sea, which gets the least amount of light, making it the darkest of the three dimensions. The point is the light of the sun and the extent of its influence, because God said in the beginning, "Let there be light." That was God stating what the issue was and would be concerning the fate of this world, because it involves the revelation of his Son shining in the darkness of this world in order for us to be saved. In a literal sense, a cubit is the length of a man's arm. It was approximately 18 inches in length, stretching from the elbow to the tip of the longest finger. We're told the golden image was 6 cubits wide and 60 cubits high, which would make it about 9 feet wide and 90 feet tall. If we consider the image's dimensions being used in a symbolic sense, the number 6 would most likely be God defining its width in terms of the same fourth commandment, because in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth. So the number 6 does point to the Creator as God. But more importantly, it also points to the prophecy that says those 6 days are really 6,000 years, which is the amount of time that God would give to Satan to exercise his power of influence over the three dominions that he stole from Adam. That would be the measure of the image's width stated in verse 1. The problematic issue we face is the image's other dimension, which is given as its height. In the same symbolic sense, the image's height was 60 cubits, which presents us with a real problem. The golden image in this diagram is not properly represented according to the dimensions we're given in verse 1. We can't take that dimension seriously because it makes the idol way too tall. The golden image shown here has the proportions of a real person. Any artist that draws or paints the human figure knows that the body has certain proportions. Artistically, the body is measured in terms of its head. The head always determines what the proportions of the body will be. No matter who the person is, their proportions are always determined by the size of the head, and the body's proportions are, for the most part, always the same. The body is always 3 heads wide and 8 or 9 heads high. No person, no matter who it is, will have a body that measures 10 heads high, because it wouldn't be anatomically correct. It would in fact be an anomaly, because it just wouldn't make sense anatomically. This diagram shows what an average body would look like based on the width of its head. As we can see, the image shown here looks perfectly normal. While it might seem like the body's proportions aren't relevant to this discussion, the fact is they have everything to do with it, because the proportions of the golden image in verse 1 just don't make sense. Remember, we said that the image's height was given as a factor of 10. That would mean the image that Daniel says Nebuchadnezzar built was 9 feet wide and 90 feet tall. If we take the dimensions of that image literally, the image's proportions are skewed, because the image would have to look something like this. If we allow for what the Bible says the image looked like, it would be almost unrecognizable. The image shown on the right shows just how ridiculous the dimensions of the 6 by 60 cubit image would have been. It just doesn't work. On top of that, also bear in mind the fact that we have no idea how thick the image would have been, because there is no mention of its third dimension, which is its depth. Once again, the point is made that the image itself is one big anomaly. In terms of its dimensions as an idol, it just doesn't make sense anatomically. Now, it could be argued that the image was realistic and that it did look like the king. Some have maintained that the height of the idol actually refers to its dimensions as it stood on a pedestal, which is what we see here in this illustration. If we agree, for the sake of argument, that the idol was anatomically correct and that it was mounted on a pedestal, we would then have an even bigger problem than we had before. We would have to ask, did the 9-foot width that we are given refer to the idol, or did it refer to the pedestal? We wouldn't be able to say, because there is no mention of the idol being placed on a pedestal. So we have no way of knowing what the idol's dimensions would have been concerning any of its 3 dimensions. In that case, the only thing worse than having 2 dimensions would be to have no dimensions at all. That supports the argument that no matter how we slice it, the dimensions stated concerning the idol must be understood in a symbolic sense, because the idol just isn't being referred to realistically. Daniel's dimensions concerning the idol make sure of that. In Daniel 3, the golden idol measures 60 cubits high, which is 6 multiplied by a factor of 10. Since 10 is always the number that signifies a covenant relationship, and 6 is the size of the image measured across, the dimensions proportionally represent a covenant that is being associated with the last days. The point here is that Daniel doesn't want us to see this image as literal, because that really isn't what's important. Daniel says the importance of this image is what it represents spiritually, precisely because it isn't measured realistically in terms of what would be a real image, anatomically speaking. This is consistent with what we will see in the prophecy of Daniel 7, where this same covenant being the one that is so cleverly hidden here in chapter 3, is also foretold in the context of a backslidden Israel in Isaiah 28. In Isaiah, the prophecy is understood to be a vision concerning the end, mainly because it was also partially realized with respect to literal Israel. To put it simply, we might say, the foot can fit inside the shoe, but the shoe definitely does not fit the foot. The word of the Lord to Israel was, "Because ye have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with hell are we at agreement." This covenant will be more fully explained in the study of Daniel 7, which concerns the coming of the Antichrist. What's clear here in Isaiah 28 is that the worst pain that any human can experience is the pain of guilt and shame. And no guilt or shame will ever be greater than that of realizing, as a professed believer, when my turn came to stand with the Lord and be saved, I turned my back on him. I betrayed him and those that have rightly represented him, even as Judas Iscariot did. And now I can see that I'll be lost forever because I'm realizing what my sin really was. What I've done keeps playing again over and over in my head. It keeps coming home that I had the chance to be counted among the redeemed, but I didn't have the faith or the courage to take my stand with the King of Kings. I can't live with myself and the decisions that I've made, but I can't turn away from them either. My soul is drowning and I can hardly breathe, but it isn't any body of water that I'm drowning in. I'm drowning in an ocean of guilt and shame because I know now that I won't be excited when I see the Lord's face, and he definitely won't be excited to see me. The book of Daniel is written as a chiasm. That means the theme that is explained in Daniel 3 will be repeated and further explained in Daniel 9. The point of the chiasm is the dual application principle that we call the spirit of prophecy. God always says in the beginning what will happen in the end. That is the dual application principle of Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. It's always incumbent upon me to get right with the history because everything else depends on it. Failing to understand what God says in history means I will fail to understand everything else that the prophecy is referring to. The history lesson of Daniel 3 involves the king of Babylon and his failure to appreciate what God has stated to him and through him. Having missed the point of his first vision, the king allowed his own ego and his lust for power to get the best of him. But the king's desire to be exalted was sternly rebuked by God, who revealed himself to the king in the midst of the fiery furnace. That had to be a sobering and frightening thing because it showed him what no false god or idol ever could. There is no God like the God of Israel, the God of Daniel, and the God of the Hebrew captives. The king therefore made a universal decree that stated, the Hebrews' God is the one and only true and living God. He is the one that honors those that honor him. He is a deliverer of those that trust in him. The Lord made a pagan king who knew not God a more faithful witness than his own covenant people had been. What they couldn't do and wouldn't do was done by the hand of that pagan king. The lesson of redemption involves what God is willing to do and the lengths that he will go to in order to save his children. It is, after all is said and done, what is revealed about God's character. In this case, it involves a loving parent that had to punish his children for being woefully disobedient. Daniel 3 concerns Israel's covenant relationship with God, which was altogether dysfunctional. But even then, in the most stressful of situations, it was the fate of the Hebrew captives who, through no fault of their own, would be God's faithful witnesses to the monarch that had conquered them. The Hebrew captives were the elite of Israel who were chosen to personally serve the king. It was always God's plan to use them because in doing so, he could save both them and the pagan king that had conquered them. More than once, they faced a life and death situation that put their faith to the ultimate test. But in every instance where they found themselves in trouble, the Hebrew captives never wavered from their faith by virtue of their example, which really is the point. To state it plainly, the thing that God is showing us is how we should conduct ourselves when that situation, which was theirs, will soon become ours. If it's really true that the prophecy in history will be the prophecy of the end, one can only hope that we will do half as well as they did, because their example of faith and moral integrity was a light shining brightly in a very dark place. While so many people who honored the king allowed themselves to be bullied, the Hebrew captives were the only ones that made it clear to the king that they would serve God only, bowing themselves only before him. The image of the beast is one that we often talk about, but it has yet to be rightly understood. Having failed to appreciate what Daniel is saying in each chapter about the covenant, the church has been guilty of putting the cart before the horse. First, God explains what the image is and where it came from, and then he defines the beast. The term image of the beast is a loaded term in the sense that both words need to be explained contextually. A horse that pulls a wagon can be called a vehicle, but neither one alone can be referred to as such. Once God explains what the image is, only then will he talk about the beast. The third and highest level of biblical understanding is prophecy, precisely because prophecy concerns the covenant relationship and how it will be consummated. The Alpha-Omega relationship, shown as this chiasm, is the prophetic key because it concerns the history that reveals itself to be both what is the message of redemption and what will be the conclusion of the matter. The predictive aspect of the prophecy is what almost everyone has been concerned with, but it is not and should not be the first concern of the believer. When the only concern of the believer is what's going to happen next, what really happens is, A, the believer presumptuously overlooks what's actually being said. It's assumed that he or she already has an airtight relationship with God. B, the covenant and the believer's relationship with God concerning that covenant can and will be lost sight of. It doesn't occur to the person that the covenant is the real issue. Satan understands that our eternal destiny is our covenant relationship confirmed and validated, which makes it the all-important focus of his attention. While Israel disregarded the covenant, Satan made sure that Israel would never give it the attention that it deserved. That was his plan then, and it worked. So why would he try and do things any differently the second time around? What kind of relationship do I have with my God? That is the all-important question, and it's a question that should make us tremble in fear, because God tried for 490 years to get Israel to see the problem, but he never could get through to them. It should be painfully clear that the point of Daniel's prophecy is God had no choice but to punish Israel. He had to get the people's attention and somehow get them to take a long, hard look at themselves so that they could see who they were and what they were doing to themselves. As a nation that had been taken into captivity, God would give Israel one last chance to redeem herself as his covenant people. The period of history that Daniel had to address would be the last 490 years that God would give to Israel in order to return to Palestine, rebuild the city and the temple, and receive the gift of God's Son, the promised Messiah. It should also be clear that the temple destroyed and then rebuilt is the point of the prophecy, stated in the context of history, which is the terms of the covenant defined. Remember, history is the time period that God has allotted for his plan to be executed, because the plan is the covenant ratified. Israel's temple was destroyed in the beginning by the hand of the conquering king, and the temple was restored, being rebuilt by the exiles that returned home for that purpose. That is the prophecy as it concerns both Israel's, them in their day, and us in our day. 490 years was determined to be the last straw on the camel's back as far as God was concerned, because the point that God had been making all along was Israel would fail to pass her final exam, which was supposed to be the ratification of her covenant. That period of failed history was represented in the first 6 chapters of the book, which is, according to its chiastic structure, the alpha or the beginning of the prophecy. This diagram shows how the history of the first 6 chapters becomes the prophecy of the end time scenario. We saw this earlier in the study of Daniel 1. From start to finish, the first half of Daniel is a veiled prophecy of the end. The 3rd chapter of this half says, Satan will persecute all those that will not accept him as their redeemer. He will single them out and threaten them with a death sentence if they will not bow down to him. The good news in all of this is so mind-boggling that it's almost impossible to believe, because the story is so incredible. In the prophecy of Daniel 3, God has warned us that the whole world will be taken captive by the wiles of the devil, who will appear and promise everyone both prosperity in this world and eternal life in the world to come. At that point, it will seem as if all is lost, because the whole world will accept this miraculous being as his promised redeemer. But at that time, there will be one small but nagging problem. It will be the witness of a faithful few who will not accept this false Messiah. He then will declare they must be silenced, put them to death, and everything will be okay. That will be the deceiver's promise that everyone will buy into. The decree will be given, and the people will accept it. But the saints of the Most High, who will have stood defiantly against him, will then be delivered. God will redeem his people and destroy those that wanted to destroy his bride. At that, the most decisive moment that will come in all of history, the conflict between good and evil that had first begun in heaven will once and for all be finished.